Well, welcome everybody to the Lancaster Community Library. I'm the director here, Alice Cooper, and this is the continuation of the library series, A Special Evening With, and this evening we're featuring Margaret, Forrester, and Karen Hart. We'll mention, before we go on to program, the library is going to have its annual Author Expo on July 6th, and we should have nearly 30 authors downstairs, so you're welcome to come and visit and talk to the authors from the region. And our keynote speaker is Jessica Walker, who is an author and illustrator and an instructor at the Parsons School of Design at the New School. So we're really excited about that, and that is on July 6th at 1 o'clock. So this evening, we are going to hear about indentured servants in Colonial Lancaster County, featuring Executive Director of the Historical Society, Karen Hart, and researcher, Margaret Forrester. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to have a lot of slides up which have a lot of words. We don't expect you to be able to read all of them, but I will post these later on the Historical Society website, and there'll be a recording of this that you can also go back and watch on Facebook. We're also trying a Zoom recording so that we might have a close-up of the slides as well. We're also, just to let you know, going to be using some period words tonight and terms in describing the indentured servants. There's a servant and master relationship. We will also, in some of the original records, see terms like Negroes and slaves. So we're going to be using those terms of the period right out of the documents that we're talking about tonight. So indentured servitude had a long history in England before it came to the colonies. And as early as 1349, there were English laws talking about servitude. They had a big overhaul in 1563. And at that point, there was a compilation of laws regarding indentured servitude, and that was still in effect in 1607 when Jamestown was founded. So they're using English law when they first come here. By 1619, there's already an influx of immigrants, indentured immigrants, and the General Assembly passes a law requiring servants to register with the Secretary of State upon arrival. Their master then would have to go and certify the terms of their agreement and all the conditions. And at that point, it also said in the law that women could not marry, indentured women could not marry without the consent of the master, and that carries on through the years, as you'll hear about later. Between 1630 and 1680, according to the Encyclopedia of Virginia, which is most of this timeline came from with some additions, and we'll be talking a little bit about that. Encyclopedia of Virginia, you can actually go on and find the primary source documents, so you can read all about this. There's also another website that I'll show you later that has about 38 pages of laws all about indentured servitude. So when you're looking at what's happening in certain years, you really do want to go back and figure out where in the legal timeline you are to understand why people have different lengths of indenture and different punishments and such. But between 1630 and 1680, nearly 75,000 people immigrated to the Chesapeake Bay colonies, 50,000 of whom were indentured servants. So that's about 2/3. Some historians for Virginia alone have put it at about 3/4. So that is your main source of workforce coming into the colonies, mainly for working the tobacco fields. In 1633, a traveling Dutchman came to Virginia, and he noted there was a high mortality rate among newcomers of the indentured servants, and there was very poor treatment. And the Virginia Assembly recognized that, and in 1642 or 43, depending on which calendar you're using, with the year starting in March, the General Assembly passed laws regarding the time of their servitude if you came without a contract, You had to carry a certificate of your contract. Masters were prohibited from hiring servants without proper papers. And servants who became pregnant were punished in various ways. You were punished if you married without permission. There was a penalty for harboring or dealing with a runaway servant. And that punishment, however long you were gone, you had to add double that to your time. And on your second offense, you could be branded on the cheek with the letter R. Later they say the neck. And then later on, even on the first offense, they say in 1659, they would say, cut the hair short so that you are observable to other people as having been a runaway. So in that original time in the 1642 law, if you were over 20 years old, you served for 4 years. If you came without already making a contract in England before you got on a ship, and you'll hear about that process. If you were between 12 and 20, you served for 5 years, and if you were under 12 years old, you served for 7 years. And again, these are some of the different types of laws, some of those that I mentioned, but you can go in and read the original ones. 1657-58 was another major General Assembly law. That changed it to if you're over 16, it's 4 years. If you're under that, you would serve until age 21. And so they revised the time of service. They granted servants the right to take complaints to the court. And for secret marriages, both the man and the woman in the marriage, if they're both indentured servants, would be punished with time added to their service. In 1661, there were laws requiring sufficient diet, clothing, and lodging. And you'll see that in some of the indentures, the actual papers. And cruel treatment was prohibited. The master shall not exceed the bounds of moderation in correcting servants beyond the merit of their offenses. But again, there was redress that servants could make a complaint against the master and that be taken into the courts. In 1672, we're already seeing some definitions dividing indentured servants and enslaved people. In the early years, you could have indentured blacks from Africa coming in with indenture. It's really hard to tell in the records the difference. But by 1672, there's a law saying all servants not being Christian, which is their way of saying the African. All servants not being Christian imported into this colony by shipping shall be slaves for their lives. So it's a very definite distinction between the white Christian from Europe and England. By 1676, in the 1660s and 70s, there's a lot of laws about runaways. There's also one about the General Assembly tells masters you cannot sort of be trying to make side deals and trick your indentured servants into extending their term. Like everything has to be by the book, by the indenture or a new court record. In 1690, we see again a big shift for enslaved Africans and African Americans, accounting for nearly all of the Virginia gentry's workforce. What the Encyclopedia of Virginia says are the non-elite workforce, slaves, enslaved people are accounting for 25 to 40%. So you might have a lot more enslaved coming into big plantations, but your middle class, middle upper class that could still need some workers and field workers and house servants could still be using indenture. And this goes on into the 1750s with where Margaret's book will end, but even past that, as we'll see. And then another big one in 1705, that was a big revision. Again, it's talking more and more about the difference between treatment and punishments of enslaved versus the indentured servants. But also at that time they changed the length of service to if you come over without an indenture and you're over 19, you're only going to serve until age 24. And the courts would judge your age. And the other thing, you had to prove your indenture, so documents, paperwork was very important. All masters of servants shall provide and find wholesome and competent diet, clothing, and lodging, and shall not at any time give immoderate correction, neither shall at any time whip a Christian white servant naked without an order from a justice of the peace. However, if you were an indentured servant who broke the law, whereas free people might pay a fine, if the indentured servant could be punished by whipping, that was 20 lashes equaled 500 pounds of tobacco for a fine, or 50 shillings for a fine. Again, they were able to complain to the court if they thought that was not correct. And sick and disabled servants, if a master said, this person, I'm not getting my money's worth out of this person because of illness or sickness, they could be remanded over to the church. Remember, at the time, the church and the government were kind of synonymous. But the master had to pay for their upkeep, but that they're not going to take that on just themselves. If the servant survives, they're going to be sold, their indenture will be sold to another person, and they'll be in debt to pay back to the master. So it's very much an economic situation. And freedom dues in 1705, you'll hear about those. Most of the indentured say your freedom will be according to the custom of the land. And it got to be known that you would usually get corn and clothing. However, that was not actually in any law until 1705. And in 1705, they were required to give male servants, upon their freedom, 10 bushels of corn, 30 shillings or like value of goods, and a musket. And women were entitled to 15 bushels of corn and the equivalent of 40 shillings. And you still see most of that equivalency is probably in the clothing, because we see that continued on. The other law one that I told you about, 38 pages, but it's nicely separated out with headings about what it is. But if you want to go and read that, that's on the Christ Genealogy website, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that later. But right now, I'm going to turn it over to Margaret, who's going to tell you about her research specifically into records in the court records of Lancaster County and some of the findings and patterns that she has seen. And as you're coming up, just again about the sort of the shift from indentured to enslaved. This is a 1771 advertisement in the Virginia Gazette. It's talking about Leedstown, just up in Westmoreland County. The ship has arrived with about 100 healthy servants. Instead of field workers, you're seeing men, women, and boys, among which are tradesmen, blacksmiths, shoemakers, tailors, carpenters, joiners, cooper, bricklayer, plasterer, painter, watchmaker, glazier, silversmith, weaver, jeweler. So those tradesmen, skilled workers, are what the indentures are about at that point. In the same newspaper, we see ads for slave sales, and they're talking about having sales of 20 slaves in one of them, the other is 30 to 40, and they say likely Virginia born. So by this point, slavery has become entrenched. Unfortunately, it's a self-perpetuating system of labor, in that once you have an enslaved person, their natural increase, their children are going to be enslaved. So Virginia planters aren't as concerned about bringing in immigrants from England and Europe anymore to do those hard labor jobs. The system of slavery is becoming entrenched. All right, I'm going to take this with me and do those slides from over there for you.
Well, welcome all of you, and I'm so delighted that you all are here and have taken your time to come and hear this speech. The book that I'm working on is the records of the indentured servants just of Lancaster County from 1650 to 1750, and no, it is not finished. It's still a work in progress, but we'll get that. Am I not being heard?
Let's keep talking.
Okay. As Karen said, you will see her presentation for the PowerPoint. Yeah, don't let it go. Up there with the original records. And I will be paraphrasing those records as I go through the speech here. And forgive me, please, for sticking to my script here. Believe me, if I go away from it, you're not going to be happy here. The purpose of the talk tonight for me is to give you a talk about what life was like for these very real people who lived here in the 16th and 17th century and went through the indenture process. Real people such as William Cottrell, John Blake, Thomas Marsh, Edmund Benson, John Henley, James Pierce, Gallon Packett, Robert Hill, Abraham Bush, Robert Saunders, James Horsley, Ann Bennett, Jane Pruitt, and Elizabeth Clark. These are the names of just a few of the indentured servant population in Colonial Lancaster County who are included in my upcoming book. Now, if you paid attention to those names, what do you notice about that?
They're all like county people.
Exactly. These names are still here in this county 400 years after the indentured servant system started. And that's, to me, that's just amazing that the families are still here. And it's a wonderful thing. Within this book are the records of nearly 2,000 souls who were indentured servants of Lancaster County, Virginia. These records, covering the years 1650 to 1750, are abstracts of the Lancaster County deed and will books and the order books, and are presented in chronological order in the coming book. There's no alphabetizing here whatsoever, except in the index. And it will be entitled The Records of Indentured Servants, Lancaster County, Virginia, 1650-1750. The indentured servants were mostly children and teenagers, some as young as 3, who came to the Virginia colony from England, Ireland, and Scotland. And the record that she has up there, dated the 9th of October, 1700, is about little Mary Jones, servant to Robert Carter, adjudged to be 3 years old, and to serve for 21 years. I don't know about you, but I think that's horrifying. Many of these children were kidnapped from the streets of London or the bustling seaports, or otherwise coerced into coming to the colonies where a huge labor force was needed to tend the tobacco and corn crops. Others were put on board a ship on the colonies by a parent or parents who could no longer look after them, especially in the case of a father who was left with maybe 5 or 6 young children. The mother had passed away in childbirth, and he had no means of taking care of them, so he put them on the ship and sent them over here to the colonies. Still others were older individuals who were convicts and were sent here, or trying to escape the persecution and poverty of 17th century England. Some individuals came to Virginia with an indenture, which is a written document made in their native country before they boarded ship. In the 17th and 18th centuries, an indenture was a document often written in 2 halves, and you'll see an example of this in a minute. The indenture servant system was a contractual labor force in which the servant agreed to serve his or her master for a finite number of years, after which they were set free. And I'm probably not telling many of you anything new here so far. The images that Karen has on the screen here, the first one is an example of an indenture dated 5 June 1683, which is a servant immigrating to Maryland. The second one is an indenture contract dated May 20th, 1784, the servitude contract of one James Bracken. And the third one, dated 17 August 1766, indenture of Patrick Morgan. And that one appears, it's not going forward. Here it is. It appears to be torn. You can see the wavy line at the top there. On the reverse of that same contract is a message that says that Larkin's indenture was traded or sold to a new master after his ship arrived in the Potomac River. So he leaves England expecting to be with one master. When he gets here on the Potomac River, they have already sold him to somebody else. So he really has no choice in that matter. However, most of the indentured servants came to Virginia without an indenture. In this case, they were sold to a master and appeared in court to determine their age and length of service, which was usually until they reached the age of 21 or 24. This applied to both male and female servants. This information is revealed over and over again in Colonial Lancaster County court records. 2 examples are as follows. The first one, dated in 14 May 1662, is a basic record of an indentured servant. You see them like this all the time. That's all the information they gave. But this was Matthew Toogood, servant to Nicholas Hale. coming without an indenture and a court order from the time he was to serve. Another record dated 11 March 1667-68 shows the added information of the servant John Grant as adjudged by the court. Several of these records name the ship on which they arrived, such as the record that you see now dated 9 December 1663. This record names the ship the Duke of York. Other ships named and throughout the records in Lancaster County that I found, and most of which docked at the port of Rappahannock, include the Adventure of London, the America, Amity, the Amity of London, Anthony of London, Bristol, House of Friendship, Isaac and Benjamin, the King's Frigate, Leonard and James, Providence of London, Rainbow of Plymouth, the Recovery, and William and John. To name probably just a few. So sometimes when you're looking for a relative back in these days, we have immigrant records in the library that name the ships, and it's important to maybe know that. It will help you find, because they will also have the passenger list on those ships. One other record concerning the arrival of people who would become indentured servants is the one dated 10 February 1663-64, which is a complete record, and these were rare. They always left their something. This is from Mr. John Kent, and it gives his owner, his coming in without an indenture, his adjudged age, and the time he was to serve, plus the name of the ship that he came on. So that's a pretty complete record, and a rare thing. The indentured servants and others coming to the Virginia colony in the 17th and 18th centuries were brought here under a system called the headright system. Prior to this, persons who wished to come to the colonies would offer their services as an indentured servant as payment for their passage. Under the headright system, a person, usually belonging to gentry, could pay the passage from Europe to the colonies for himself, his family, and others. And it's these others that's their focus tonight. In exchange for this, that person would be given 50 acres of land per person or per head for those whose passage he had paid. Certificates of land or certificates according to Act of Assembly were granted to these persons who paid the passage, as in the record dated 30 September 1657, which shows Lieutenant Colonel Henry Fleet being granted a certificate according to Act of Assembly for the transportation of 17 persons into this colony. And they name all 17 persons. And Court is a Negro, Roma is a Negro, and the rest of those are the white people. But if you notice that list, they're not differentiated.
Could you speak up?
I guess you're speaking from Mike.
Does it need to be closer? Is that better? Is that a little bit better? I can't go over here.
There you go.
Yeah, but I can't read my notes. Anyway, we'll work it out. Okay. Is that better? I'm sorry that you couldn't hear. So anyway, when they did just a normal passenger list, and my book is full of these records of the certificates of land, they don't differentiate between free persons and those coming over as a servant. Except for, there's always exceptions to everything. There's a record dated 11 March 1695-96, which can be seen in this record 1377 in my book, just ignore that, which shows Mr. Robert Carter granted a certificate according to Act for the transportations of persons listed as white servants. And then there was a group of some 55 African Americans, and then 5 more persons listed as white servants. So this particular record actually says it, that they're coming over here as servants, and that is really rare. It's very unusual that they would do that. The passenger list in record 450 dated 11 May 1663, and this is why I put these in there, includes 2 men named Adam Whelan and Charles Williams. In the first record, you can see that Adam Whelan and Charles Williams are in this anonymous passenger list here, and their passage was paid by one John Merriman. In the next record, you can see the same 2 men, Adam Whelan and Charles Williams, are now indentured servants for John Merriman, and they're his runaway servants. Didn't take them long to do that. These 2 records have the same date. Obviously, these events did not happen on the same day. This is when they were recorded in the court. So this is why we put those certificates of land in there, because you can see the passenger list and then later on see them as somebody's servant and what happened to them. In the 1600s, all indentured servants and enslaved African Americans worked in the field. Everybody. male and female. It was seen as an economic necessity for the landowners of the time, but was brutal work. The slaves and the indentured servants, both male and female, worked from sunup to sundown. The work consisted of such jobs as making the tobacco hills, harvesting the corn and tobacco crops, toting rails, weeding peas, hew or axe, mauling and sawing, chopping down trees to make way for the fields of crops, hauling logs. They name all these things in some of these records that they've gone through. And of course, all this work is done by hand, maybe with the help of a mule or a horse, but that was it. By the 18th century, more indentured servants were taught a trade and would even come to court to plead to be kept to their trade and not sent to the fields. As seen in the following record, they were adamant that they did not want to work in those fields anymore. This was dated 14th May 1729, the record of John Beaufort, who was a shoemaker and a servant to Robert Biscoe, who for himself and his heirs promised to keep John Beaufort to his trade and not to suffer him to be turned to work in the ground for a drop of corn or tobacco. For this, Beaufort agreed to serve his master 1 full year after his indenture was expired. They would do anything to be kept to that trade. Also included in the book are the 18th century records of orphans of families who were already living here in Lancaster County. When their father died, and often on the prayer of their mother or another relative, these orphans were bound over to a master who was sometimes a relative of their parents. Being an orphan in these colonial days did not necessarily mean that both parents had died. Usually it just happened that the father died and the mother wanted a better opportunity for their child. These orphans were treated as indentured servants, and that they had a finite number of years to serve in which the boys were taught to read and write, as well as the trades such as shoemaker, weaver, cooper, house carpenter, or joiner. The girls were taught to read and sew, knit, and spin. My 21st century womanhood here is assaulted over and over again with these records. And you women out there can probably identify with this too, and you'll hear it over and over, what happens to these women. Record dated 8 February 1739-40 is a record of one Joseph Bailey, who was the orphan of John Bailey, deceased. Of his own free will and on the prayer of his godfather, he was bound to Gowan Valley until he reached the age of 21. He was to be taught to read and write and to learn the trade of a house carpenter and joiner. At the expiration of his servitude, Joseph would be paid as was the custom for indentured servants. So even the orphans were treated that way. Maybe it's tightly a little bit better because the master that they went to would have been known by the family, either a neighbor or another relative. Maybe that helped a little bit. In colonial Lancaster County, the indentured servants had recourse to the courts if they had a grievance against their master or mistress. I appreciate so much all the background that Karen gave you just a few minutes ago, and I was sitting there chuckling over there in the corner of all the things that Lancaster County did not do for their indentured servants. The following grievances, there were 6 of them that I will talk to you about, came up the most often in all the records. Abuse of the servants. Above and beyond the daily abuses they suffered at the hands of their master or overseers, there were cases such as that of Moses Galloway, and the record dated 10 July 1734, who belonged to Thomas Hubbard. That's another local name that's still around here. Moses was so barbarously used by his master and was in such a miserable state of health that the servant, being near the end of his servitude, was likely to become a charge to the parish, which was, in this case, was Christ Church Parish. In the second record, the opinion of the court was that the defendant, Thomas Hubbard, take the said Galloway till his time is expired and was to get him cured and pay the costs of court. That didn't work out too well for Moses Galloway. The second one was a record dated 10 August 1735 concerning one Maurice Harrington, servant who was abused by his mistress, Catherine Delaney. Although she beat and abused him, the court ordered that Catherine use Maurice better for the future and pay the costs of court. It was just slap on the hand. So both of those servants ended up going back to their original masters, and hopefully it turned out for the better for them. The second grievance that came up very often was that concerning base-born children, which in the records are called bastard children in the 17th century language that they used. And these were born of servant women during the time of their servitude. These women were punished. So here we go again. The women are getting punished by having to serve extra time at the end of their indenture, and were sometimes, if they could not pay the fine imposed on them, whipped at the county whipping post. If the fathers were known and caught or confessed, they served time in jail until they could pay a fine imposed on them. The children born in these circumstances were often ordered to serve the master until they reached the age of 24. In a document dated 11 March 1673-74 is a typical record of this incident. A lady named Anne Rain, who was a female servant having a base-born child in the time of her servitude. Her punishment was to serve her master 2 more years after the time that her indenture was expired. And that was typical. They tacked on 2 more years at the end of their indenture. Case marked 12 March 1672-73 is the case of Anne Saxon, who was a base-born child of one Joanne Saxon. It was a case which explains what often happened to the child born in those circumstances. In this case, the master, Robert Beckingham, is willing to keep the child, and she is to serve him according to act, which means until she's 24, probably. The case dated 8th of March, 1670-71. This goes back to even my Dr. Pierce books with the babies. This case shows that the county had midwives that they used to determine if a servant was with child or not. And in this particular case, the midwives were Diana, the wife of John Upshar, and Elizabeth, the wife of Nicholas Percoy. It was ordered on their testimony that the servant maid was not with child in this case, and I think the accusation was dismissed and court costs, of course, had to be paid. Crimes committed by the servants against their masters or mistresses. These run the gamut, from stealing to killing marked hogs, to murder, to burning down the tobacco barns, to striking and verbally abusing their masters. You name it, they did it. The servants were not angels either, as neither were the masters. This case, dated 31 May 1746, involved John Scarron, who was a servant man belonging to David Galloway, who was charged with the barbarous murder of Tobias Horton Jr. And those of you who have done research in colonial times know that the Horton family, Tobias Horton Sr. and Jr., were very prominent citizens of the county. The purpose of the trial in Lancaster County was to see if there was enough evidence to send the case to the city of Williamsburg to a court of Oyer and Turner. It was so determined, and the prisoner was removed to the public jail in Williamsburg to await that trial, was supposed to be the second Friday in June next. So this trial was in May, so the very next month they were to go to trial for that murder. There were also cases where the master or overseer killed the servant, as in the case of William Lax. Dated 10 December 1687, the case of William Lax, under suspicion for murdering one James Baxter, his servant. The trial in Lancaster County determined that Lax was to be secured in jail without bail and awaited trial at the next general court held in James City. There was a record of 8th October 1665. Our friend Matthew Toogood again, that showed up at the very beginning of this, and William Payne. They were servants to Nicholas Hale, had killed a marked hog belonging to a man named Michael Arm. As punishment, these 2 men were to serve Michael Arm half a year after their time by indenture was expired, or pay 500 pounds of tobacco and cask, each one of them. There was a man named David Brooks who was supposed to be in charge of these servants, and he tried to conceal the crime from everybody. And for that, he was charged 1,000 pounds of tobacco to Michael Arm. Record dating 11 June 1721-22. This one is really unusual. No, Ann Stewart. Skip Mary. Ann Stewart. This is an unusual case of a servant named Ann Stewart, who actually belonged to Pitts Curtis of Northumberland County, Virginia. She pretended to tell fortunes and be skilled in physiognomy, and that's how they spelled it in the record. We know it. Are we there?
Yeah.
Okay. And they, of course, now it's physiognomy, where you study a person's face and can tell their character or whatever by looking at that, which resulted in her deceiving and cheating many of the citizens of the area. She was brought to trial and her story was heard. The court was of the opinion that she came within the statute in like cases and needed to be cured of her evil ways. As you can see, Anne was ordered to be given 39 lashes on her bare back and her master was to pay all court costs. There was a speaker for NNK 250 at Historic Christ Church, Dr. Harris, that spoke about indentured servitude up there. And there was a gentleman in the audience in the Q&A session that asked him about gypsies and the indentured service. And this lady, Ann Stewart, sounds like she might have fit that bill. That maybe she was a gypsy who had been bought as an indentured servant over here. I don't know, it didn't say that. So. One of the next grievances that they could come to court for was illness or injury to the servants, where the master was kind of ignoring it. This is illustrated in the record with the case of William Morris, who came to court in 1701, and explained that on the trip to Virginia, he sustained an injury to his leg that has continued to grow worse to the point of having to have his leg removed. A doctor, they called it chirurgian or chirurgian, we looked that one up, in the record, was assigned to treat William's leg, after which William freely and voluntarily agreed to serve his master, Robert Bristow, 6 months after the expiration of his original indenture. So he was one that was able to get help. In the case dated 3 February 1701, there's a similar case in the record where there was an indentured servant, John Evans, and his wife, who were the servants of Richard Lennis. And she was the one that had the injured leg this time. And John Evans pleaded with the master and offered to serve a half a year longer if he could help his wife and cure her leg. And there was all kinds of illnesses and injuries. They had distemper, they had smallpox and measles, all kinds of things. And many times the master would just ignore it and have them keep on working no matter what, until it just got so bad. That something had to be done, and of course, luckily the servant had recourse to the court so they could complain against the master for this. The biggie is the runaway servants. I think the masters must have spent 60% of their time going up and down the Rappahannock River and the Potomac trying to get these servants back. This was the most frequent of all the crimes committed by the servants. The punishment by law dictated that the servant served twice the time for the time he or she was away. If, for example, he had run away for 10 days, then he would serve 20 days for the time he was away. They also had to serve extra time for the expenses incurred by the master for getting them back. This could be anything from a few months to 1 or 2 more years after their indenture time was over. The record dated 9 December 1674 is a typical case of servants like William Hancock and Matthew Williams confessing in court that they had run away from their master a certain length of time. You can see that up there. The master also stated to the court the cost he paid them in getting them back. They were to serve their master 10 days extra for the 5 days they were gone, and then 6 months more after their indenture expired for the cost of the master bringing them home. The record dating 11 March 1662 was actually in 2 records. The case of several men. There were 4 men in the first record who not only ran away from their master but stole his boat. And sometimes people would do this and steal the master's boat plus extra food, extra clothing, whatever they could take away and get away with. This time it was just a boat. And they were the servants of Mr. Henry Corbin. And these 4 men left in June and did not return back until December, or were not brought back until December. In the next record, there's a 5th man also involved in the second record. This one got me. The servant, Thomas Marsh, is the one seen to be the instigator of that whole affair. So if any of you all are related to the Marshes from Muscogee County, he might be one of your ancestors. Lancaster County also hired men to go and search for these, bring them home. These men were often in court to get their pay for doing so. The record dated 8 March 1671. A certificate was granted to Mr. Samuel Jewell for taking up with a runaway servant named Anne Reynolds. It was found that Mr. Jewell had done his job, and the case was ordered to be returned to the next assembly. Runaway servants to Lancaster County that were found here came to us from the counties of Northumberland, Westmoreland, Richmond, Old Rappahannock, Charles City, King George, Gloucester, and Caroline. And I dare say that the servants in Lancaster who ran away went to those same places. I can envision them waving at each other, going up and down the Potomac River, and as they're running away from their various masters up and down these different counties. It was really no laughing matter because the master depended on these servants, and the worst thing was that they ran away when crop came due, and they had to harvest the crop. Bless you. The punishment was a lot worse if they ran away when the crop came due. That was a terrible thing to do. And she has images, Karen has images here. I don't know what I would do without Karen. She's just absolutely fabulous at putting all these things together. But these are ads from the Virginia Gazette. She has two of them, one dated 1739, and the second one dated 1746. And the interesting thing about the second one is that the man who placed the ad was a Mr. James Robb, and he himself had been an indentured servant in the 1720s for Robert Carter. And then he gained his freedom, and he was able to, apparently, to get started his own farm, and now he had his own indentured servants who were running away from him. I don't know what that means, what that said. Another grievance that they could address in the course was they're seeking their freedom, the disagreements over time served, and also getting their freedom dues. Sometimes they would say you were free, but they wouldn't always pay the freedom dues, and the servant would keep coming back until it was corrected and they got what was due to them. This was the time when all the excuses by the servants were given as to when their time expired. Most of these concerned their actual indenture. Some said they had the indenture on board the ship and it was stolen. Others said they lost it in their time of servitude, and both of those likely probably did happen to some of these people. Many of them did not have an indenture to start with, and expected the court to take them at their word for the amount of time left to serve. There was one case where the master tried to convince the servant that he was to serve for life, but since there was no paperwork to back that up, the servant was set free by the court, mercifully. There were also many other times when the court had enough evidence to side with the servant who was seeking his or her freedom, and freedom was granted. In some cases, the court granted the servant time to find the necessary documents which would prove to them the correct indentured time of the servant. There are three records that are going to come up. I'm only going to discuss the second one. The second one is in 11 January 1664-65, which concerns a servant named Daniel Jackson, who was declared to be under the age of 16. She mentioned this in the laws when she was talking to you before. And he was ordered to serve until he was 24. But as always, which always kills me, if the said Jackson could produce an authentic certificate out of England, which would prove that he was above the age of 16, then he would serve 5 years from his arrival. So the servant was given the opportunity somehow to either go to England or send somebody in his stead to maybe find a birth record or something that would prove his age. If you could do that, then they would change the time of service. And so this ends the section of the complaints that the service could go to court for. Marriage of the indentured servants. For most servants, the period of servitude was meant to be one of celibacy. There were some servants who came to Virginia as married couples and pleaded with the court to keep them together with the same master. Otherwise, the servants would have to have the consent of the master to marry. Due to this policy, there were very few accounts of marriages which took place during their servitude. In the case of women servants, the master did not want the loss of labor of the women during their pregnancies and their lying-in time. You can see how that worked out in the section on the baseball children, right? This next record, Karen and I went back and forth on this one. A lot of these records, of the 2,000 or more that I have in the book, have a lot of layers of what you want to know, about the people and how did this happen, there's lots of layers, and this is definitely one of those. In 1670, there was a case of Ruth Falks and Robert Bryant concerning a contract of marriage. To the court, there appeared no cause of action was needed, and the case was not prosecuted, non-pros. However, later Ruth, who had been charged with paying the court costs, became the servant of Hugh Brent, and as such could not pay the costs. Her master agreed to pay the cost, and Ruth was to serve him extra time after her time by indenture was expired. So Karen and I kind of went through this thing, and we go, were they servants when they married? Was Ruth Fox a servant then, and did she marry a free man, and Robert Bryant? Why was Ruth charged with the court costs and not Robert Bryant? Thank you, back here. Yeah, I mean, why, and here she was, and then she became an indentured servant. Why did she do that? You know, if she was married, unless something happened to Robert Bryant. I did go on Ancestry and early colonial settlers of Maryland and Virginia and tried to look and find Robert Bryant to see what happened there, and came up empty. So I don't know, but you can see, as you read through the record, a lot of questions come up. And they did this with a lot of these things. The next section, in the deeds and wills of Lancaster County, there are some examples of the servants receiving gifts from their master for work well done, as follows. The document dated 9 January 1722-23 is the will of James Whaley. Here we go with another name that's in our county, presented by Oswald Whaley. James had a servant named Matthew Stanton, who was a weaver, and who, in the case of said Whaley, did not live to give the servant tools to work at his trades. Then his will was that his son Oswald pay the estate 1,000 pounds of tobacco for getting the same tools. So he wanted to be sure that that servant got the tools he needed for his craft of weaving. Another record, 14th of March 1660-61, is a similar case in which the servant John Smart looked after his master when he was ill, said he was extraordinarily diligent in taking care of his master. The master told him that after his death, John Smart would be free. And of course, you can see by the record, it appearing to the court that John Smart's servant to Mr. James Banks Merchant deceased, so he is deceased already. The court determined that the master, Mr. Banks, was deceased and declared John to be free. At the end of their servitude, the indentured servants were set free, and according to the Act of Assembly, were given corn and clothes. Normally, the corn was 3 barrels of Indian corn, they called it. The clothing depended, of course, on whether it was male or female servants, and the master himself, how much he could afford to give them as far as clothing goes. By the mid-18th century, some servants were paid in pounds of tobacco in lieu of the corn and clothes. The record dated 11 March 1667-68 is a typical example of a servant getting his freedom and declared by the court to have his corn and clothes. End of story, right? 14th July 1669, some male servants received much more for their freedom dues if the master wanted to reward them for extra service, such as James Morris, servant to William Clapham, in the record dated 14 July 1669, as I said. On July the 14th, James received his freedom and 6 barrels of Indian corn instead of 3, and 4 suits of apparel, 1 bedstead with the covers, and 1 cow cap. And they kind of go on about that cow, if something would have happened to the cow and how it would be replaced. And this is for a servant who continually ran away from his master. And I'm going, wait. But apparently every time he came back, his work was exemplary, and the master appreciated what he did, so he ended up rewarding him with those extra clothes and extra corn. The following is an example of items received by the freed women servants. Dated 9 December 1663, the servant Elizabeth Shepherd, who was a servant of Edward Dale, was given her freedom and given 3 barrels of sound Indian corn, 1 new cotton petticoat and waistcoat, 1 new pair of shoes and stockings, and 2 new smocks. And you will hear more about Mr. Edward Dale later on with Dr. Bob Lumpson as his book finished on that gentleman. And then the last one is a servant being paid in tobacco instead of in lieu of his freedom corn and clothes. So that was, and that was early, that's 1663. Most of those, that didn't happen until the 1700s. Most of the time. So what happened to the indentured servants once they were granted their freedom? Most of the freed servants were still very young. They only had to serve till 24, and they were very poor. Some would leave Lancaster County for greener pastures elsewhere. Perhaps they had relatives in a neighboring county or friends who would take them in for a while. Many, however, remained in the county and worked as tradesmen or landowners. Sometimes an old and faithful servant would be allowed to remain where they had worked their whole lives. So there were cases where there was a servant and the master who had an agreement with each other. When the indenture came to an end, the master said, I like your work, I want you to stay. The servant says, I want to stay, and stayed his whole life and worked for them. In conclusion, remember back to the beginning of the speech, the Lancaster County family names that I listed at the beginning of the speech, such as Blake and Marsh, Clark and Pruitt, Pierce and Bush. Now imagine these people in the often dire situations that we have just discussed, that they went through. then imagine them later as free citizens of the county after their indenture was expired, with skills either of a farmer or of a trade, and then their future ahead of them. Remember, most of them were still young. They obviously survived, as some of their descendants are still living here in Lancaster County today. And before I let you go, I just want to say that I'm on a mission of sorts. I'm on my own little soapbox here now, but this story goes. When I worked in Northumberland County in the Historical Society there, I collated and compiled the records of the enslaved African Americans, and it's in 2 volumes, from 1650 all the way through to 1865, which names all of them, and names all of their masters, and also what happened to them in the courts, and which is similar to these records of the indentured servants in Lancaster County. Our friend Preston Haney authored the book on the indentured servants for Northumberland County and certificates of land. He included them also. It is important to me that these little voices be heard because they contributed so much to the growth and the economic growth of Lancaster County and Northumberland County, and they have done so through the centuries. So that's my mission, is to let those voices be heard to everybody. So thank you very much. I appreciate your being here and listening.
Before we wrap up, I'm going to give you a quick tour of some other ways you can do research on indentured servants. And these will be local and ones if you are looking outside of Lancaster County and outside of Virginia. But one that definitely deserves some attention tonight is the Colonial servant database that was put together by Patrick Heffernan, and he's in the audience tonight. So you can direct more questions to him, but I thank you, Patrick, for giving me your blessing to share this and talk about it a little bit. And we found one of these advertisements on this website that we were able to share with you. So if you go to the Historic Christ Church website, which you see here, you can get into this research. And I decided just to do some screenshots because you never know what happens when you're trying to do live demonstrations. But this will give you an idea, and all of the resources that I mentioned to you, if you remember the basics of it, you can search for them online and find them pretty easily. But this database has several ways of getting into finding information about servants, about names that are recorded in the various documents, and you can look at the different kinds of documents. And it goes beyond even some of the types of documents that Margaret used, which were mainly the court records, the order books, deeds, wills sometimes. I don't know if you got into this. Deeds, wills, and orders. Well, I know you can't really see. Let's see for the next one. You're down at the bottom. There's court orders, tithables, import certificates, indentures, deeds, wills, inventories, letters, diaries, and parish documents. So there's a few things from the Carter estate and the Carter records that go a little bit beyond the court records that are available. But this database encapsulates about 300 documents, more than 800 namings, and that's every time a name is mentioned in a different document. And from those namings, Patrick has tried to take those black and white names in a document and then stitch them together and look at them if they're repeated to try to figure out who the person was. Would you say that's a fair description? That's my understanding of reading the site. So you might find the names spelled differently a few times, but it's really thinking, okay, as you've seen this name show up again and again, and if you take those entries and you kind of think about them together, it makes a story of a person. And so more than about 300 servants are identified based on the analysis and interpretation of those names. So being able to, as Margaret said, think about them as people. And even going beyond their time of indenture, there's examples on here of finding names later in like tithables where they're shown as a head of household, so indicating that they did get their freedom and they're later showing up as free men in the records. As I mentioned, a little bit of the difference between namings and servants. You can do a search on various ways. You can look at things alphabetically. You can sort of just, you can pick a letter and look at things, or you can search specifically for names. So one way to go about it is, let's say you had an ancestor named Margaret Upton. You know that much. Let's put her into the system and see if there's any, if we think she was a servant. And you can put that information in, and there's all kinds of advanced ways you can search, but I simply put in Upton, and I get a result. This is blown up so you can see a little bit better. A person's name, the male or female, a short description out of about who she was based on the records, what work she's doing, when she's first named and last named in various records, who the master was, how she arrived, what happened to her later if it's known. And you notice it says namings 2, so there's 2 types of documents naming Margaret Upton. And if you click on those, you would get the detail, you get a little bit more. This is one of the documents. I know it's hard to see that it's small, but it comes from a letter. I picked this one because it wasn't a court record. There's a letter in 1721 from Robert King Carter to John Pemberton, a London merchant with whom he's doing business. Of course, it's going to come out on me here. If I can pop up. I have to go out on this. Shelley, you might have to reconnect me here. Here we go. Let's see. Connect. Right, this is new. Screen share.
That really is one website. I don't want to research. Thank you for that. And I ran across John Carter and Robert Carter hundreds of times when I was doing this.
All right, here we're back up here, and so it just gives you more. And in fact, this letter actually mentions 2 people and describes them as servants. And it says that Margaret Upton, the best woman servant I ever had in my family since I was master of one. She married very well after she was free. And then he's asking his businessmen to recommend 2 more servants. And there's a mention of another one, John Babe, who's described as an extraordinarily good writer. And so you get, and then you can go into, well, if you search for namings, instead of just getting the person and then going into the documents, you can search and get a whole list of the documents to read. So it's just different ways of going about it. I mentioned Encyclopedia Virginia here. If you search indentured servant, then as I was reading some of the entries, I realized, well, if you say indentured with a D, it's not going to find the word indenture. So that's another way to search. But one of the key articles is indentured servants in Colonial Virginia, and a lot of the information that I gave you at the beginning came out of there, but there's about 50 primary documents that you can go on here and look at, and that's done through the Virginia Humanities. The Library of Congress has a wonderful resource page as well about indentured servants. guides.loc.gov/indentured-servants. And again, I'll put a resource list of these on the Lancaster Historical Society website afterwards. But this is a screenshot that you can see on the side that has sections. It has an introduction about the history of indentured servants. You can look at books, periodicals, newspapers, online resources. It tells you a little bit of background about courthouse records. And specifically the section on online resources has quite a few different things. Most of these are free to look at. And one of the most well-known ones is called the Immigrant Servants Database by Price Genealogy. And that's where I got a lot of the laws from first. But this is a searchable. This is all of the American colonies. It comes up, as you see, with over 20,000 names. You can go into it and search very plainly and pick a letter and see examples. But so they say their aim is to create a reconstructed passenger arrival list for people who came to colonial America as indentured servants redemptioners and transported convicts between 1607 and 1820. So this does take it further. Yeah, the experience in different colonies is going to be different. Some places, I don't know this for sure, but we've learned in school a lot of times, 7 years and they got some land afterwards. Well, we see that's not true in Virginia, but it could be if we follow other colonies to see what happened there. And they talk about, again, everybody's got a slightly different definition of indentured servant or who they're looking for. As Margaret mentioned, in the head rights, which was when, as a planter, I'm paying to bring people over, because for every person I say I brought, I'm getting land. Well, you know, sometimes they'd be on their own list, their relatives would be on their list, and then some of the people were actually indentured immigrants on that list. So you can't always be sure that they were immigrants. But this will explain who's in this database and who isn't. And a redemptioner, I haven't seen that in Virginia in anything I've encountered, but redemptioners are defined on this site as people who left England or Europe. They didn't have any money when they left, but it was on the promise that when they landed, some family member or person here was going to pay back their passage. And if they got here and that person didn't pay for it, then they would be sold into an indenture. There's a bibliography on the site that is pages and pages of where all the information comes from. It's really great because it's geographic. So if you know you want to look for somebody, you want to find out about Maryland or Massachusetts, you can just go to that section and find out what some of the records are. And you can see also some of the other things that are on there, learning centers, it talks about experiences, origins, how to look up people from where they, you know, a little more what the resources are for finding people in England, the laws, a great glossary. There's also an article that's really good that's reproduced here. I would encourage you to take a look at it, called Origins of Colonial Chesapeake Indentured Servants, American and English Sources. Again, looking back at what records are out there for finding people in different places. There aren't a lot of immigrant ship passenger lists, which is why we have to create all of these different ways. But there are some records in England that have survived that have some information about people leaving from that side of the pond. So as I mentioned, you can do a simple search. I picked the letter C, and this is what you get. You get a list of names, the colony, a date of servitude, and then you can view a little bit more about them. Also, if you did an advanced search, which I did, there's a whole lot of categories you can put in, but place of indenture, I said Lancaster, colony, Virginia, and I got 1,117 matches. And hopefully all 1,117 of these are in Margaret's book too. But again, the way they define indentured servant, it might be a little bit different. Here we've got, I picked Mary Abbey because I know why they put the headline big and the information you really want is this big. I don't know, but we can it tells us that Mary Abbey had 9 years of indenture in Lancaster County. It gives a record about her, which is also in Margaret's book, from February 1690. But this record does not say anything about serving 9 years. So where did that come from? If you look at the footnotes, and it got cut off because of the size of the screen, there's 2 different footnotes, but only 1 abstract shown. So, as you see down here, if you have Margaret's book, you're going to get both of them, and this is the one that they don't give you the actual citation for, that shows her coming into the country without indenture and appealing to the court and being ordered to serve 9 years. And then later, she has a child, and that's what the other record is about. Lots more bibliography. Margaret's book will have a long bibliography in the back, but there are lots of things online, some great dissertations, PhD dissertations, master's theses. So these are all searchable. You can download them, and I would, if you want to know more, this one, Stephen Harris Scott at the bottom, that's the person who spoke a couple months ago at Historic Christ Church. his study is a lot of mostly Westmoreland and Northumberland, but he's came from a science background, so there's a lot of statistics in there, and he does bring in some Lancaster information as well. And then, as Margaret mentioned, a couple of the Preston Haney books that talk about servitude in Northumberland, one an article in the Bulletin and one a published book. Also Richard, sorry Phillips shouldn't be on there twice, it's Richard Hayes Phillips. He's written some, I kind of object to the title of his book, but that's what he decided to call it, Without Indentures, Index to White Slave Children in Colonial Court Records, Maryland and Virginia. I do, as we've tried to say, there are similarities to these types of bound labor, but there's many, many differences as well. And I think that's important to think about as how the two developed. So I know that was quick. Like I said, I'll post these later. And of course, we are a wonderful reference. We'll have Margaret's book out in hopefully a month or two. We're tweaking on it, redoing, fixing up the index. And we thought we might learn some things tonight that we needed to add or subtract or tweak.
I'm bogged down with the index.
Yes, yes. But we will take questions if anybody has any, but thank you. I hope this will inspire you to go out and do some research of your own.
Who did the Lancaster local data?
So there's a lot of the records, especially the early 1600 years. A couple named Sam and Ruth Sporacio went to the courthouse or used the microfilm records, and they did most of those short abstracts that you see in Margaret's book. However, when those end, Margaret herself went to the courthouse and got out the original book and made her own abstracts. But abstracts and the way people interpret the names, especially 20 years ago, or people not from the county looking at names to try to read the handwriting, we always encourage you, read the abstract, but go get the record because you might find out more. Like the whole thing with the marriage, like there's got to be some more backstory, or after 1750, keep looking in the records going forward to find out what happened to the people, because you're going to see them show up in different ways if they stayed in the county.
Primary gig is what they well, I'm an old-fashioned I believe in doing the old-fashioned research, going record by record and seeing and getting better. And Ruth and Sam's Palacio, I'm amazing all over the state of Virginia of abstract records. They're very complete, even for an abstract.
Yeah, and Patrick's been reading the original records as well, and I don't. There's deeds, like when people got their headright certificate, they go to the courthouse. They say, "I brought all these people." It would be in the court record. They get a certificate. They take the certificate to the colonial government, and then they would get their actual land certificates. Those are recorded. There, you can see images from the Library of Virginia. They're almost impossible to read now. So somebody 20, 30 years ago went through those, and thank goodness they did as best as they could at the time of abstracting them and indexing them, because they're almost impossible to read today.
17th century handwriting, especially is the worst. When you get into the 18th century, it starts to make sense. Until you read it over and over, you start to see what they were trying to say, but it's not easy at all.
Yes. Yes.
When I was doing research on the Cleveland Bureau for Lancaster and Northumberland, I found that the indentured system continued into the 1870s with Orton.
Okay.
Maybe beyond. And there would be a contract, including usually it was like a blacksmith or a trader. If they were a boy, they were required to